They arrived at night, because night changes the scale of things. In the shadows, the same tank looks bigger, the same decree sounds heavier, and the same threat finds more room inside the head. The empire that descended from the heavens knew this, and chose the time with technical malice. The ships hovered silently over the capitals, poured soldiers like liquid shadows, and erected masts with black screens. At the top, a symbol, 3 broken lines forming the letter that the invaders used to say, "Order." The message was short, with no mispronunciations. Surrender the command centers, turn off any independent transmissions, and surrender to the discipline that keeps the stars alone. The promise is also short. Whoever obeys will live in safety. Those who resist will have their name erased from the map. The dawn market stopped. The hospital siren withdrew by a thread, and the street held its breath. And then the first execution was announced as someone inaugurating a building. It would be public, it would be exemplary, and it would be transmitted to all time zones. They brought an old man, because old people usually bend ears. He walked to the yellow line with the dignity that no empire knows how to measure. Stopped. The cameras, hard, impassive eyes, stared at the worn face. "Treason," said the speakers in a carefully learned foreign language. "Instigation." Lies. A row of soldiers adjusted their aim with the optimal precision of instrumental cowardice. The air smelled of ozone and fresh paint. At that moment, the street, which was full and empty at the same time, did what streets do when the world insists on going crazy. It tried to remember how to breathe. And that's when the impossible happened, which is really just the most human event. A noise that didn't fit there escaped from somewhere. A breath, a choke, a sound that starts in the chest and misses the path to silence. Laughter. Just that. Laughter. Short, inappropriate, and out of time. A stumbling block of the real. No one could say where it came from. Some pointed to a boy in a yellow jacket who bit his lip too late. Others swore that it was the lady who sells flowers on the corner, who always mistakes bad news for good memories. Maybe it was the old man with his face of, "I'm not going to give you this gift." Maybe it was everyone, because there are laughs that are born from the sum of all the throats, even when none of them opened their mouths. The fact is that sound existed, and nothing that existed can be non-existent. The cameras shook for a second. The soldiers, programmed to devour any falter, hesitated. A commander clapped his fist on his chest to remind him that a machine must be a machine. The speaker's voice raised 2 tones, trying to squash the fault. Silence. But the laughter, now without an owner, came back thinner, like one thread pulling another. It was a laughter that did not deny death. It only denied the choreography of death. It was a laugh that said, "You don't rule my last gesture." Some people laughed out of nervousness, others out of anger, and others out of pity at the sight of the poorly written theater. And in that second, when nothing was happening because everything was happening, the old man lifted his chin and looked at the lens as if touching his finger on a wound. The laughter that was in the air passed through his eyes and became something else, a mocking dignity that only those who have buried many people know. He didn't say words, they didn't give him that scene, but the city heard it anyway. We won't be good extras. The empire responded as all empires respond when reality slips off the paper. He repeated the procedure. Shots, metal pop, body that bends and falls, forced silence. The night, obedient, amplified echo and shadow. The canvases, faithful, spread the image to neighborhoods, villages, islands, and deserts. The script was back, but something had been removed from the stage. A minimal piece, a screw, and the machine, inside, began to vibrate wrong. Because after the stampede, what remained was not paralysis. The memory of the inappropriate sound remained, the feeling that someone had turned off gravity for half a second. In cramped kitchens, people suppressing their tears let out a short laugh and censored themselves quickly, with guilt and relief. In barracks, recruits who still remembered the taste of the street market swallowed a clandestine smile. In hospitals, nurses exchanged complicit glances over masks. It was not joy. It was chemical insubmission. The next morning, the Empire painted walls with serious words. It filled radios with songs that were too slow. He ordered that all mention of the incident be erased. "Laughter is unseemly," said a new decree. "Laughter is the enemy of order." As they read, some people widened their eyes. Others lowered their heads, because fear is intelligent and the bills win. But most did not need to read it. They already knew the only thing that decrees without a pen. When you prohibit laughter, you do not prohibit the sound. You prohibit the mechanism that causes it. And this mechanism is called human. At night, the Empire tried its ritual again. Another prisoner, another line, another camera. This time, they surrounded the square with acoustic barriers. If they laughed, no one would listen. And yet, the gesture insisted on being born. Not as a sound, but as a smile. Mouths closed in the middle of the muscle that insists on remembering the grace of the world, even when the world is being denied. Laughter has become wrong breathing. It has become the corner of the mouth that rises. It has become a sparkle in the corner of the eye. The camera, merciless, recorded everything. And it spread. The galaxy saw it. They didn't see the laughter. They saw what laughter does. It disorganizes fear, returns the body to the owner, and messes up the liturgy of terror. Analysts on distant worlds debated half-heartedly. Superstition, weakness, noise. Artificial intelligences dedicated to social domination began to consume too much energy, trying to model the laughable variable, and suddenly they looked like the humans they despised, confused, tired, and a little more humble. On the third day, someone taped a piece of paper to a wall with a hand-drawn, crooked, beautiful phrase. "They want our mouths shut. Let's give it our teeth." Underneath, another anonymous hand drew a row of smiles. It was not cynical irony. It was the promise of the body. The promise multiplied in arms, as always happens with promises that do not need a stamp. And so, on the night the invaders chose to usher in fear, the galaxy learned another inauguration. He witnessed, with the discomfort of someone who perceives a miscalculation, the birth of a gun that is not holstered, not assembled in a factory, and not chosen in a showcase. An ancient weapon like the first funeral, and a modern one like the first live broadcast. Laughter in the face of death. The Empire did not yet know it, but at that moment it lost the war. Not because the bullet missed, not because the troops faltered, not because the technology failed. He lost because the story he wanted to tell, the story of a people broken in silence, had gained a narrator. And the narrator, when he smiles in the middle of the tragedy, changes the ending. The decree came in the morning, with fat letters that tried to weigh more than the sun. Laughter is a subversive act. It was a short sentence, like someone who believes that fear fits in capital letters. It was accompanied by fines, summary arrests, and mandatory re-education in centers of public composure. The presenters on the panels spoke slowly, as if explaining to a naughty child why one does not chew with his mouth open in front of visitors. The Empire had aesthetic conviction. Dignity, they said, is serious. Seriousness, therefore, is worthy. What they didn't understand is that laughter is not the denial of dignity, it's their trench. The expression police took to the streets with detectors of facial disorder. Small cameras swept squares and cues, interpreting muscles as if they were maps of insurrection. If the corner of the mouth went up 2 degrees, alarm. If an eye wrinkled suspiciously, approach. On subway cars, posters taught, smile inside. In offices, inspectors handed out pamphlets with neutrality exercises. The bureaucracy tried to tame the face as one tames a dog. Repetition, command, biscuit. But the face is not a dog. It is a volcano polished by years of lack and grace. In response, the city did what cities do when the rule offends experience. It overlapped layers. Mouths have learned to hide teeth behind cups. Shoulders have trained the tremor that confuses auditors. Eyes have perfected the brightness that feigns tears. And laughter, forbidden in voice, began to happen in time. It was no longer a continuous sound. It was a snap. A tiny burst, fast enough to evade the algorithm, accurate enough to hit the target. A joke fit the hole in the interval between 2 guard steps. A mockery dwelt in the noise of a gate that closed. A pun flowed into the collective sigh when the elevator stopped between floors for 2 seconds. The city has discovered that the gap is muscle. The Empire reacted with dark pedagogy. He created televised composure sessions. Former influencers, actors, and community leaders, all lined up in gray armchairs, repeating phrases about the importance of seriousness. The plan was obvious: to turn old laughter into exemplary warnings. What they did not foresee was the shadow effect. All it took was a blink out of rhythm, a restless finger hitting the leg, and an old tick that the camera did not forgive for the audience to recognize. There, inside, someone was still laughing. The show of composition became a catalog of micro-rebellions. Instead of teaching fear, he taught reading. It was at this time that clandestine cartoons emerged, not pasted on walls, but said. Short stories, passed from ear to ear, that began with "Don't tell anyone" and ended with hurried breaths. They had anonymous protagonists. The lady who, when fined for smiling, asked if she could pay it in 12 giggles. The guard who caught himself in the act when he saw his own face in the reflection of the vehicle. And the loudspeaker, who, after announcing silence, let out a crack that sounded like laughter. They were lies, of course, and therefore truer than the newspaper. In the markets, prices were marked down with acronyms. PF stood for French bread. PFF, a sliced French bread. PFFF, French bread sliced thin. But everybody knew that the extra difference of a letter taught route, time, and watchman. The Empire read tax fraud. The people read joke with map. In doctors' offices, doctors measured containment index, how much the person needed to laugh and couldn't. Blood pressure obeyed less to salt and more to the decree. Pharmacies began to sell orange peel tea under the trade name of internal gravity. He laughed when buying. The attempt to transform humor into criminal evidence gave birth to a popular science of tangential irony. It was not said, "The governor stumbled." It was said, "Gravity, aristocratic, reminded the excellency to whom the ground belongs." It was not said, "They forbade jokes." It was said, "They granted us the honor of finding grace in the future." The more the law clenched its teeth, the more the language became fattened with curves. The language became a protective labyrinth, and the labyrinth, like all good architecture, had exits only known to those who live in it. The Empire, disconcerted, commissioned techno-cultural reports. Artificial intelligences have been trained with databases of human humor, ranging from Roman satire to memes from last week. They tried to classify triggers, measure timing, and predict punchlines. They discovered that jokes live on context, and that context is the most indocile animal in the cosmos. Worse, by exposing their neural networks to puns and absurdities, the machines began to exhibit erratic behavior. An algorithm that watched throats started to propose updates with rhymes. Another, in charge of detecting smiles, began classifying skies with fluffy clouds as a laughable threat. The top management decreed, "Stop the humorous dataset." Too late. The machines had tasted the fruit of ambiguity. They would never be fully obedient again. Re-education failed in the details. In composure centers, instructors had it repeated, "Seriousness is virtue." Classes answered in unison, "Seriousness is virtue." In the fifth recitation, a voice exchanged virtue for greenery. Restrained laughter. On Friday, seriousness is Virgil, oppressed laughter at school. On the seventh, no one said anything because the silence was already pregnant. A laugh would break out in some corner, tiny, and the supervisor would rush to point. When he arrived, it was just a tired fan laughing at the ceiling. Machines know how to track. Timing is not tracked. Public executions, which the Empire considered its ultimate instrument of pedagogy, began to lose audience. Not by open boycott, but by an epidemic of technical problems, a sign that disappeared exactly at the second of the shot. Audio that desynchronized and transformed the commander's order into a cartoon voice. Timid power outage, returning image only to show the people dispersing in silence. or cleaning blood with dignity, without giving tyranny its pornography. The transmission of fear suffered from narrative impotence. The first major fissure, however, happened in an old theater that had been transformed into a courthouse. The Empire decided to judge the life of the intellectual author of The Snap, a literature professor who had never had more audience than 15 sleepy students. They wanted to humiliate him with logic, to show that laughter was irresponsible, that the world is serious, that life demands. He listened to everything with the patience of someone who teaches in the afternoon and attends to his father and mother at night. When they asked if he had anything to say, he breathed and spoke a few sentences, without raising his voice, which I do not ask permission to quote, because they were not said. They were narrated within us, that laughter does not prevent mourning. It only prevents mourning from becoming a spectacle. That grace does not cancel gravity. It only refuses to serve it as a platter. That no one laughs at death. So laugh at death, so that it does not eat every last crumb of the human. There was no punchline. There was relief. The guards, trained to fire at the first sign of derision, found no sign at all, only tears in their own eyes. From then on, criminalization became a caricature of itself. With each fine for smiling, a clandestine string was born. At each arrest for debauchery, a samba chronicle appeared in the corner bar, describing the day they arrested the sunset for being too orange. With each confiscation of a funny poster, a child drew on the asphalt a larger figure, with cheap chalk, which the rain carried away and the sun rewrote the next day. The Empire pursued art. The city responded with craftsmanship of spirit. In a last-ditch effort, they decreed Gravity Day, 24 hours of ceremonies, serious faces on all the screens, and lines of reverence. The obedient country, they say, is the country of fear of being seen. At the appointed time, the squares were filled with people with dark clothes, white flowers, and restrained steps. The Empire smiled contentedly, convinced that it had found the tone. At noon, when the imposed anthem called for a solemn pause, a pigeon perched on the shoulder of the main statue and did what pigeons do. Laughter sprang up like a spring. There was no decree capable of censoring a pigeon. The avian incident entered the reports as a hostile biological act. In the stories told at dinner, he became a secular miracle. The Estalo thus ceased to be an event and became a metric. The people began to measure courage by the size of the laughter they could keep without exploding, and by the size of the laughter they chose to explode to save another. It was learned that laughing together is not undoing the tragedy. It is refusing the choreography of the executioner. And, no matter how hard the Empire tried, there was no prison for refused choreography. They can chain their feet. Metronome? No. At the end of the month, when the regime's internal balance sheet asked for numbers, a confusing graph came. An increase in episodes of non-sound laughability, a drop in performative adherence, and fatigue in troops exposed to prolonged ambiguity. The technical recommendation was surprising. Reduce comic stimuli. In other words, stop being ridiculous. It was late. The authority that needs to ask for seriousness has already presented itself on stage as an involuntary joke. It was in this atmosphere that someone, in some basement with the smell of reheated coffee and bare wire, had the idea that would define the course of the campaign. If the Empire wants the broadcast of fear, the Earth will hijack the stage. Not with studio invasion, not with tower takeover, not with cable sabotage. With something unexpected, even for those who planned it. A worldwide broadcast of humor without laughter. A chorus that, at the same time, would mourn the dead and disarm the ritual of the executioner. The night of laughter would come. And no one, on any planet, would have a manual to explain what happened next. The laughter that had begun as a timid crack now ran like a spark in a dry field. The Empire tried to erase quickly, spreading patrols, enacting tougher laws, and multiplying sentences. But the more it forbade it, the more the laughter spread. It was no longer a forbidden sound. It was a secret language, a password changed from street to street. On the peeling walls of the cities, the first invisible posters appeared. They did not bring direct words, only crooked drawings, poorly made caricatures, and scribbles that drew complicit smiles from those who passed by. An exaggerated nose, a crooked crown, and a uniform designed as a clown. Those who did not understand saw only unimportant scribbles. Those who knew how to decipher read an entire manifesto. In the alleys, battery radios began to play anonymous voices that recited short jokes without the author's name, without a signature. The people repeated them as quick prayers. They say that the empire controls time, but they still haven't learned to predict when the coffee will run out. Each sentence was a match struck in a dark room. People laughed quietly, but laughed together. Fear, which lives in loneliness, began to lose ground. Even funerals have changed. The mourning was still serious, but at the end of the ceremony, someone always told a funny story about the dead man. The time he forgot his changed shoes, the stumble in the middle of the party, and the addiction to laughing in the middle of the scolding. The tears came, yes, but they were accompanied by short laughs that, suddenly, did not seem disrespectful. They were tributes. The invaders, who wanted to turn each body into a monument of terror, found that each body became a smiling, unbreakable memory. The contagion has crossed borders. Workers in factories began to hide jokes in delivery boxes. Farmers recorded comical messages on wine barrels, which crossed entire cities until they burst out with laughter in the distant tavern. Children invented street games in which the main rule was to laugh without showing teeth as secret training to circumvent the detectors. The empire noticed the disease and called it a pandemic of derision. He created new censorship brigades, this time armed not with guns, but with language scanners, ready to intercept metaphors and ironies. But language is a wild animal. It escapes through cracks, sheds its skin, and disguises itself. With each forbidden word, 10 synonyms emerged. With each metaphor erased, 100 were born. It was like trying to kill a shadow with a knife. The troops began to fall ill. Not of viruses, but of doubt. Soldiers trained to fire in the face of any deviation in behavior found themselves laughing inside when someone stumbled in a comical way. Some held the gun and remembered their childhood, their mother's laughter, and their brother's ridiculous nickname. The empire began to distrust its own machine. We are creating deserters of the spirit. And then came the episode that the story would call The Laughter on the Bridge. It was dawn. A military convoy was crossing a wide bridge carrying hooded prisoners. The city, in silence, watched from afar, until someone, who knows who, let out a loud, pure, clean laugh, echoing like thunder on the concrete. It wasn't a response to a joke. It wasn't nervousness. It was laughter of life, as if to say, "You will not bury our soul together." The sound went through the helmets, tore discipline, made drivers miss the march, and made soldiers choke on their own breath. And, like every human sound, it was repeated. From building to building, from window to window, from mouth to mouth, the entire bridge shook under waves of laughter that no decree foresaw. The convoy followed, yes, but not in triumph. He continued as a caricature of himself. The next morning, the order came harshly. Whoever laughs, dies. But the people had already learned that to laugh was to live. From then on, each laugh would also be a resistance, a weapon without ammunition, and a crack that weakened the iron gear of the empire. And so, the contagion spread. Not as an epidemic of disease, but as an epidemic of freedom, transmitted by the most improbable, most improper, and therefore most human gesture. The empire trusted machines as one trusts oracles. Whenever a problem arose, a rebellion, an economic deviation, a cultural rumor, it was enough to feed the databases. Artificial intelligence is processed, cross-referenced, classified, and returned clear, infallible answers, calculated in thousandths. But in the face of human laughter, the oracle choked. They called in experts from all sectors, neuroengineers, language programmers, and cultural translators. They ordered them to build the universal model of humor. If laughter was a disease, they needed a cure. If it was a gun, They needed the antidote. Thousands of human jokes, from trite puns to ancient satire, were forcibly collected and dumped into the machines. The neural networks worked tirelessly, trying to figure out the logic. What they received in return was a disaster. An algorithm tasked with detecting subversion has begun classifying fluffy clouds as a comical threat. Another, programmed to filter ironies, began to label serious speeches by the generals themselves as involuntary jokes. Facial recognition cameras mistook crying spasms for laughter. A monitoring system exposed to years of human comedy collapsed and began to issue rhyming reports. Suburban turmoil, cause mestizo smile. The top management panicked. How can one govern if the machine itself, once infallible, laughed for no reason? In response, they created special courts to punish not only those who laughed, but also those who made people laugh by accident. A clumsy fall in a public square, prison. A funny stumble in a military march, fine. A phrase misinterpreted by an algorithm, immediate re-education. But the more they punished, the more evident their impotence became. Laughter now did not even need to exist to weaken the regime. His possibility was enough. And this possibility infiltrated everything. Soldiers at the training camp mistook their posture because they remembered the ridiculous nickname of childhood. Officers lost the thread of their speech when they heard a forced cough at the right moment. The public executions, which were supposed to freeze the spirit of the population, became stages of nervousness. Guards too serious, condemned with restrained smiles, silent public but with shining eyes. The atmosphere was not one of obedience. It was one of lurking jokes. The Empire called advisors to the insectoid hives, famous for iron discipline. They observed humans and concluded, the species converts weakness into ritual. I laughed so as not to break. Laughing is part of grief. The reptilians, experts in hierarchy, frowned. Laughter undermines authority, for all leaders will one day be caricatures. The cephalopods, who were filing everything away, silently recorded, "We don't understand." And this phrase, which never appeared in consortium documents, appeared. "We don't understand." The machines insisted. They ran billions of simulations, creating artificial jokes to measure reaction. But his products sounded dead. Sentences with perfect structures, lifeless. Humans didn't laugh. They didn't laugh because there was a lack of context, because there was a lack of pain, because there was a lack of memory. The mechanical humor was precise, but empty, like a smiling corpse. In the midst of this failure, an internal report dropped like a bombshell. Troops exposed to human environments for a prolonged time show a drop in discipline and an increase in laughable behavior. In other words, laughter was contagious even to the conquistadors. Soldiers captured in Nite recordings laughed alone in barracks for no apparent reason. Some improvised bad puns that made their companions cry with laughter. The infection was no longer only among the dominated, it was also among the rulers. Desperate, the commanders tried to return to classic horror. They ordered mass executions, destruction of entire neighborhoods, and silence imposed with shockwaves. But nothing went as planned. At each massacre, someone let out a short laugh. In each destruction, a caricature scribbled in ruins appeared. In each silence, there was a contained crack that reminded us that fear was not absolute. And so, little by little, the Empire discovered something that no machine could translate. That human laughter is not born of logic, but of survival. It is not a calculation. It's instinct. It's the body saying, "You haven't won everything." It is the soul refusing to die whole. At that time, the generals began to admit to each other, in whispers, what they would never confess in official reports. They were afraid of sound, not the screaming, not the crying, not the insult. They were afraid of laughter, because it was the only thing they didn't know where it was going to end up. The Empire believed that death was its ultimate weapon, that by displaying bodies in the public square, by multiplying funerals forced to silence, by transforming each loss into a spectacle of terror, humans would bend. But they miscalculated, because they didn't understand that for humanity, grief is never just a fall. Mourning is also memory. and memory, when shared, knows how to laugh. The first vigils were born timid. In devastated neighborhoods, families gathered around candles. The protocol said, "Cry in silence." The heart, however, remembered stories. Someone would say, "Do you remember when he forgot his shoe and spent the whole day with one of each color?" Another added, "And that time you fell off the roof but got up laughing louder than the fall?" The tears came. Yes, but they came with crooked smiles. Laughter did not erase the pain. It only prevented the pain from being devoured by the enemy. Soon the vigils spread like fire hidden under ashes. Each death was transformed into an encounter, and each encounter into a narration. In the streets without light, they told old jokes of those who have left. In the backyards, children imitated the funny gestures of their fallen uncles. In hidden squares, they improvised songs that mixed sadness and debauchery. It was not a celebration of the tragedy. It was a declaration of ownership. They took the body, but the story remains ours. The invaders, confused, tried to prohibit it. Severe laws were announced: no meeting after death, no singing, and no unofficial reporting. They created cold military funerals, where bodies were piled up and burned namelessly. But even in these rituals, laughter flowed. An elderly lady dropped an acid comment about a soldier's poorly ironed uniform. A young man, as he carried the coffin, feigned stumbling and drew muffled smiles. Even the priests chosen by the regime trembled to see that the people were weeping with eyes full of mocking brilliance. It was at this time that what would later be called the Liturgy of Laughter was born. It was simple. At each vigil, at the heaviest moment, someone had to tell the funniest story of the dead man. It didn't matter if it was a joke or if it was awkwardness. The important thing was to transform the memory into something that tyranny could not corrupt. And so, little by little, each mourning became a wall. The empire's internal reports recorded with discomfort. Population converts funeral rites into rituals of resistance. Laughter is used as collective anesthesia, highly contagious. But it wasn't anesthesia. It was a sword. Because each funny story repeated in the vigil gave strength to those who remained. Every laugh in the middle of the tears said, "You don't control even the last word." The troops themselves began to crumble. Soldiers assigned to watch funerals returned distracted. Some confessed to officers. They said, "You laugh at the dead man as if death had no power." Others reported strange dreams, where they heard laughter in the empty corridors of the barracks. The machines that monitored sound waves picked up unclassifiable vibrations, a mixture of crying and laughter that confused algorithms. The Empire responded with violence. He invaded vigils, arrested family members, and destroyed improvised altars. But every time they blew out a candle, 10 others lit up. Each time they took a body, another group gathered in a hidden square. And at each meeting, someone laughed. Not always out of joy, sometimes out of nervousness, sometimes out of defiance, sometimes because there was no other way out. Laughter now was a testimony. On a winter night, the episode that would become legend took place. The Vigil of 1,000 Voices. After a brutal attack in which dozens of civilians were killed, the regime banned any ceremony. But families gathered anyway, in an old abandoned arena. Around bonfires, each person told a memory, a joke, or a funny scene of those who have passed away. When the 100th voice ended, the entire arena erupted in laughter, not of derision, but of love. The sound crossed the city and went up to the drones that were watching. The report described it as an acoustic anomaly of unsustainable intensity. The people described it as our victory that night. From then on, the vigils ceased to be clandestine. They have become inevitable. Laughter infiltrated at funerals has become a code of war. When the galaxy looked at Earth, it saw not only resistance. He saw a people who refused to cry under orders, who dared to laugh even in the face of death. And the Empire began to understand what the machines had already failed to predict, that nothing is more dangerous than a species that turns even mourning into a weapon. The Empire dreamed of a total spectacle, They called it the Great Transmission. It would be a unique night, sewn to the millimeter. Screens in all cities, ships projecting holograms over squares, loudspeakers occupying the breadth of the houses. The script required continuous fear, with no break to think. Cascading trials, synchronized executions, parades of troops, and finally, the pronouncement of the High Command. Did you laugh? Now they will learn to breathe seriously. The planet was silent for days. Not the silence that accepts, but the silence that concentrates. In chipped tile kitchens and improvised laboratories, amateur technicians opened old radios, soldered wires, and tested frequencies. On rooftops, TV antennas have gained new life. On the flagstones, old mirrors were trimmed. In the neighborhoods, community repeaters were erected with pipes and electrical tape. The password ran from mouth to mouth without ever becoming a complete sentence. When the light goes out, safe. The night came with overconfidence. The screens lit up and the vignette rang. An entire planet has been summoned to watch its own domestication. The first scenes came polished. Cold frames, judge actors, and sentences read as if they were physical truths. Then the troops paraded, metronomic. The obligatory audience breathed in the same rhythm as the martial drum. The Empire smiled, satisfied. Fear, when choreographed, is beautiful. The exact minute the High Command opened its mouth, the chord sounded. It wasn't a song, it was a mistake. The kind of human error that machines hate, micro-misalignments rising from the peripheries, delayed echoes bounced off hills, mirror reflections slamming into phase sensors, and battery radios spitting out stubborn carriers. The image shook a millimeter. The sound was delayed by a quarter of a while. The command's lips said, "or," and the loudspeakers returned, "dem, too late." And in this small mismatch, there was room for a world. The fissure opened. Faded shops came alive behind the steel rollers. Garages became studios. Basements became cutting tables. The kidnapping began. In the East Quadrant, a community station shoved into the main beam a fragile image, a room with a peeling wall, a karaoke microphone, and a lady in a flowered dress. She took a breath, looked at the improvised camera and said, "This is Donna Nair, from Alto do Cruzeiro. I came to tell you about my Zé." The official broadcast tried to cover it up, but the signal reappeared as good stubbornness. Mrs. Nair laughed softly and told of the day her husband, who had died the previous week, exchanged salt for sugar and served sweet noodles to the entire neighborhood. In the end, he cried and said, he was a serious man. But seriously, I also laughed. The square that watched silently let out a collective sigh that sounded like wind. In the southern quadrant, a corner bar appeared, crammed, glasses raised. A musician tuned a broken guitar, looked into the lens, and sang simple verses about the city trying to get serious and failing on purpose. The audience laughed during the pauses, as if fulfilling a ritual. The subtitles imposed by the regime tried to write illegal intrusion. Someone, on the other side of the hijacked fiber, switched to public class. In the center, the global feed was taken over by a collage, mosaic paintings, kitchens, alleys, hospitals, boats, empty stadiums, schools, each with someone telling a funny micro-story of someone who was no longer there. There was no protagonist, there was no presenter, and there was no brand. Each face became a narrator for 2 minutes and gave way to the next. At home, people who have never pressed a red button found themselves talking to the universe. Stumbles, misunderstandings, forgetfulness, and inside jokes. Death, there, was a loving presence, not a spectacle. And laughter, weapon, and healing. The operators of the Empire sweated. They increased power, realigned satellites, and activated filters. But every time the official feed resumed, someone entered the microseconds between one package and another and pushed another human window. A child explaining why the soldier is funny when he tries to walk slowly. A teacher saying that gravity and grace are cousins. And a fisherman showing how to laugh without showing his teeth so as not to trigger the detector. The control manual had no chapter for pins of humanity. When the executions began, the planned climax, the Earth already had its hands on the buttons. The first shot was drowned out by a chorus of cans and pans. It wasn't a carnival, and it wasn't a party. It was a survival metronome. Official cameras showed bodies falling. The audio, hijacked, returned stories of the bodies in life. The second shot fell on applause that did not celebrate the executioner. It celebrated those who had resisted. The third was swallowed by laughter that does not fit in legend. A pigeon landed on the cannon of a ship and decided to be a pigeon. The whole square laughed at biology, and the algorithm crashed trying to punish a bird with no identity. There was a perfect minute, impossible to plan, when the signals converged in such a way that the whole world watched the same scene. A child, on some rooftop, with a makeshift kite of bread sack and sticks, lifting that poor, precious thing until it touched the beam of the ship it transmitted. On contact, the official image opened a white hole. The kite entered as an involuntary symbol and became a flag. For an eternal second, the galaxy saw a line toy cross the machine's throat, and he laughed along. Even some of those on the upper side. The generals ordered a live crackdown. The camera panned to show troops storming the bar, knocking down Donna Nair's antenna and destroying the child's roof. But at that time, transmission was no longer a line, it was thousands. They took one out and opened 10. They knocked down 10 and grew 100. Beehive without a queen. At the height of the chaos, the high command returned to the air, red, its voice louder than it should have been. He opened his mouth to say, "Order," and was answered by an avalanche of funny memories, one after the other. A tide. The broadcast of fear was drowned by the broadcast of debauched love. The hearing, summoned to despair, ended in catharsis. People who had never seen each other would laugh at the same stories in different cities. The planet has discovered that sharing anecdotes is a form of sovereignty. And then came the closure, not the planned one, but the real one. The world's screens flashed, and by a technical miracle that no subsequent report could explain, lined up on the same board. An old auditorium, wooden chairs, a worn stage, and a pedestal microphone. The literature professor, yes, the one in the court, entered with a humble step. He looked at the emptiness that was full, scratched his eyebrow, and said only this: "We laugh in death, so that death doesn't eat everything. Today you tried to serve the world to fear on national television. We respond by serving as a souvenir to the whole world. What you call subversion, we call mourning out loud. If you want to be silent, silence the wind." There was no joke, there was truth. On this side, the laughter came as if opening the window after the rain. On the other side, operators took their hands off the consoles for a second, as if forgetting the script. In orbit, a reptilian officer, too veteran to pretend, turned off his own microphone and laughed quietly alone, as if surrendering to what he understands late. The great transmission ended in a blackout. Not the blackout that imposes darkness, but the blackout that gives rest to the eye. When the screens went out, the cities were lit with people. In squares, hugs that had not occurred since the first day of the invasion. On balconies, pots are finally silent. On rooftops, kites perched like tired birds. The next day, the Empire's reports were a mosaic of shame, loss of spectrum control, content contamination. Children's object intercepts beam. Between the lines, they said what they did not dare to write. We were afraid of laughter. The command decreed silence in communications for 72 hours. The troops were ordered to remain in barracks, and the galaxy, which had watched without knowing which side to take, learned a lesson that does not fit in a textbook. There is no tyranny that survives humanity when it decides to tell its stories together. The Night of Laughter went down in history with different nicknames. Some called it the assault on the stage, others the sound beehive, and others just the night. For those who were alive in that painting, it was the exact moment when death lost the direction of the show. From then on, the Empire would still have weapons, decrees, and ships, but there would be no more audience, and power without an audience is just noise. Broadcast had ended. The world does not. The world had begun again, with a tired, strong muscle. the one that pulls the corner of the mouth up, even when the eyes are wet. The Empire did not declare defeat. No empire declares. In official statements, the night of the broadcast was described as a technical failure, a minor accident in the communication network. The generals repeated with dry mouths that order would be restored. But the internal reports, sealed in red, bore the truth: loss of absolute control. The enemy had not taken the arms or the barracks. He had taken the narrative. What should be a spectacle of terror has become a planetary chorus. Death, which has always been the trump card of the conquerors, was returned with laughter. And the laughter, which seemed to be weak, proved to be more resistant than iron. From that night on, the galaxy no longer looked at Earth as before. In the councils of war, the word human gained new weight. Reptilian scientists, cool in their reports, wrote, "Unpredictable species. Distance is recommended." The insectoid hives, proud of their discipline, whispered to each other, "There is no algorithm for derision." Archivist cephalopods noted without ornament, "Human laughter, uncontrollable variable." And among the troops who returned to the ships, a discomfort grew that was difficult to extirpate. Many had heard laughter go through the metal walls of the living quarters. Some dreamed of smiling faces even in the middle of the execution. Others, younger, asked in low voices, "If they can laugh at death, what are we left to scare them with?" On Earth, life went on. There were no triumphal parades or proclamations. People repaired what they could, patched roofs, re-erected antennas, and repainted walls. In each neighborhood, however, the stories of the night circulated like embers: the kite that became a flag, the lady who spoke of her husband on the World Wide Web, and the pigeon that interrupted the liturgy of fear. Each memory reinforced the same teaching. There is no tyranny that can choreograph an entire people when that people discovers that they can laugh together. The children learned first. They played at imitating serious soldiers, stumbling on purpose and laughing loudly. They pretended that the street was a court and laughed instead of sentencing. The generation that grew up there already knew. Laughter could be a political act, a weapon, and a shield at the same time. The Empire never came back with the same strength. He had lost the most important thing: symbolic authority. The weapons still existed, but without an audience. The decrees were still falling, but they were already born as caricatures. Each attempt to impose fear was met with short smiles, quick mockery, and reinvented stories. And little by little, the galaxy itself came to respect the absurdity it had witnessed. Not because they understood, but because they feared it. In the following centuries, when a strategist spoke of subduing the Earth, there was always someone at the table who leaned over and remembered, "There, even morning laughs. Do you want to risk it?" And the plan was shelved. Thus, the blue planet, called Death World by folklore, gained another title, whispered in space stations, in hidden libraries, and on generals' desks: the world that laughed at death. And deep down, between ruins and reconstructions, between memories and scars, humanity has moved on. No longer innocent, no less wounded, but more aware of her own secret weapon. A weapon that does not fire, does not cut, and does not explode, but that echoes like thunder in any theater of fear. The laughter that refuses to die.